Interventions with a king. Discussion and commentary based on articles from Jack, Cardiovascular Interventions.
I'm Spencer King, editor of Jack Interventions. I'm here today visiting with my good friend Eberhard Grube, talking about the hottest subject, I think, in interventional cardiology right now. Welcome, Eberhard.
Thank you very much, Spencer, for having me.
Yeah, well, as everybody knows, we're having percutaneous aortic valves coming and going and being studied, and now we've had the report of the first U.S. Randomized trial compared to surgery, and we're learning a few things. And great enthusiasm. I mean, I think over the top maybe enthusiasm, and throughout the world, and certainly your experience is enormous. Thousands and thousands of patients have had this. I want to explore with you some of the potential problems, because if it's like any other technology, we're bound to have things that can be improved. So what are the problems with percutaneous aortic valve implantation?
I think the partner trial that came out yesterday is raising some interesting questions, some things that we have known before, but they are really documented now in a randomized controlled trial, which is actually the first trial that puts TAVI into perspective with surgery. And I think we have identified a few things, as you mentioned, very important, the stroke rate, very important, interesting, the pacemaker rate, and of course aortic insufficiency as a consequence of valve implant. I think those are the three major, apart from bleeding, three major issues that we have to deal with in the following studies and the following years using this technology.
Well, those of us who have watched from the sidelines till now, and now we have an opportunity to engage in these trials, you, on the other hand, have been around the world putting these in and proctoring people doing this, and have observed a vast experience. And it's, I understand, giving you some ideas about how you might tweak this process a little bit. Tell us about some of the things you're doing.
Well, thank you very much. I think what's important is, first and foremost, I believe, and I said this a long time ago, that we have to deal with stroke. Stroke, in many ways, is sometimes worse than death. And if we can avoid stroke, then we have to do that. That brings up interesting new technologies to protect the brain during this procedure, procedurally at least. Then procedurally we can change and maybe modify our approach to implant this valve by, for example, not using pre-valvuloplasty, and that's what we have done in some patients with good success. So at least for the core valve implant, we know that we don't necessarily need to predilate, because predilatation might be a risk factor for aortic insufficiency if you have heavy calcifications, might be a risk factor for stroke. So different exercises might reduce the problem with bleeding and exercise difficulties. Before
you get to the access site, some would find it surprising that you could put the valve in this calcified mass and have it open and function perfectly well without predilatation, but that was surprising to me.
Yes, we have done. Well, I consider this a very early step, obviously, but I was a strong believer in the fact that the radial forces, at least of core valve, is sufficient enough not to predilate the valve. I don't think that in a living, beating heart, valvuloplasty does what it's supposed to be doing, crack what we know from the mitral valve, crack the commissure. So I thought it was enough, both from the profile and from the expanding forces, that it is enough to have this valve placed correctly and function normally. And that's what we have shown in about 60 patients, altogether 90 patients now.
Yeah, very exciting stuff you're going to read about in Jack Intervention. But the vascular complications are a huge problem with this technology. And I understand you're now interested in different access than just the femoral and the apical.
Yes. I think the apical is something that we have to very seriously consider to be an alternative. But on the other hand, we're dealing with puncturing the heart, and there might be some patients, particularly in this patient group with low ejection fraction, that you might actually interfere with left ventricular function. So I think the transaortic, direct aortic access is a very nice and very promising new approach. The surgeons like it. It's an access that they're very familiar with. A mini sternotomy, and you have direct access to the arch.
And you're also doing the subclavian, right?
Yes, we're doing the subclavian approach. The subclavian artery is a very nice access because it gives direct access to the heart. The catheters and the way from the puncture site to the valve is actually very short. And we've done some cases even with direct percutaneous approach subclavian.
Yeah, for these patients that we know are elderly and have a lot of atherosclerosis, the iliac and the aortic approach in some is just impossible, and others high risk. So the chance to do that other ways that could minimize the vascular complication and maybe the strokes as well are very exciting. So thanks for all the work you're doing, and thanks for visiting with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.